As most sectors open up and regulations ease under lockdown level 2, there is a threat of a second wave of mass infections if South Africans don't adhere to the rules. Medical researcher and co-director of the Verts African Local Initiative for Vaccinology Expertise, Prof. Helen Rees, joins us now to discuss a possibility of a second spike in infections. Prof, good evening and thank you so much for your time tonight. We are seeing it happening now in Australia. After 100 days without infections, they're seeing new cases coming up. In America, we are also seeing that we are seeing that universities are actually closing down because they are picking up mass infections as that country opened up and allowed people to get back into their spaces of learning. So a second wave is something that is real and that can happen. Can it happen in South Africa as well as we go back to our economic activity?
Yes, it certainly can. And I just want to sort of really applaud the people who've just spoken who said that they're going to continue to stick to all of the rules that we've tried to put in place. If we abandon those, and if as a community and a country we abandon those, we will certainly have a second wave. And the problem with that is if we have a second wave that's big enough, then we might find that we're forced to go back into a much harder lockdown. Now, people are fatigued. Harder lockdowns are really bad, especially for people who are poor, who can't get food. But it's also extremely bad for the economy, much worse than what we're doing now, which is sort of slowly cranking the economy up again. So, yep, you've got to stick to all of the rules, otherwise we will have a second wave.
And what drives a second wave? What are the drivers that we should avoid? What can we do about them?
Well, a second wave is interesting in the sense that it is going to be a bit different to a first wave. When this first came through, none of us had antibodies, none of us had any kind of immunity. Now, a certain number of people in our communities, and we don't know how many, and we don't know which communities will have the most people, although we could guess. Some people will now have had the virus, will have antibodies, and hopefully, at least for a short period of time, being protected. So when a second wave comes through, the virus is still going to be looking for people who don't have antibodies and don't have any kind of immunity or protection. Remember, we don't have a vaccine at the moment. So a second wave might well be different, but it might also be different if people are behaving differently, because if now, for example, particularly take young people who really want to get out, if young people start clubbing, start going to mass gatherings to party again, then we are going to see waves coming through with different groupings and for different reasons.
Yeah. I think it is important to talk about that in these gatherings, even if of 50 people, because the thing is how the virus behaves in environments like that and what we need to be aware of.
Well, one of the things we've learned about this virus now that we didn't necessarily know at the beginning is that quite a lot of people will be asymptomatic, never develop symptoms, but also that people will be spreading the virus before they develop symptoms. And we think that at that point, just before you develop symptoms and just after you develop symptoms, that's when what we call the viral load is highest, and you're most likely to be transmitting the virus. Now, one of the things that we've seen in mass gatherings, where we've seen very large numbers, for example, in choirs or in funerals, it's probably that there are people there who unwittingly, perhaps because they don't have symptoms yet or they're never going to develop symptoms, but they're shedding virus, and they're shedding a lot of virus. And so in those congested circumstances of mass gatherings where people might also be hugging or greeting each other, and somebody has got a lot of virus and is not sick, that's when you see these significant outbreaks.
And Prof, talk to us then about what the harder lockdown would assist with in an instance of a second wave, and how does government prepare for that second wave?
Well, I think the first thing is it will depend on the size of the second wave. If you look at a lot of the European countries, although they're seeing a second wave, take somewhere like the UK, the second wave isn't that extraordinary upturn that we saw in the United Kingdom. It's more gradual and it's going up. But that's because people there are still respecting the measures. A lot of people are still trying to stay at home. There's working at home. There's mask wearing. and there's social distancing. So that second wave that we're seeing in many European countries, although it's coming, is not as aggressive as the first wave. But the only way and the only thing that we can do as citizens is to stick to the rules. And, compared to having a hard lockdown, the economy closing, and all the awful consequences of that, as we saw at the beginning, to actually stick to the rules so we can keep on this sort of, as I say, slow movement towards normality. It's sticking to the rules that will allow that to happen.
Yeah. Now, Prof, initially we believed that young people will be less impacted by the COVID-19 virus. However, the World Health Organization, following that video of a pool party in Wuhan, issuing a warning saying actually the proportion of young people who are being infected or infected with the virus is growing now, and it is actually larger than what we had anticipated. What do we know?
Well, one of the things we certainly know is that this virus is nastier as you get older. It's nastier in the sense that you're more likely to be infected, but it's also nastier in that you're more likely to become severely ill and you're more likely to die. And once you get over 50, 60, and then 70 and 80, I mean, it goes up. It's a linear relationship going up with age. But that doesn't mean that young people don't get infected. They do get infected. They don't get as sick, and the mortality rate is much, much lower. But there are a few who will get very sick, and some will die in that age group, and we've already seen that. So imagine that if all the old people are staying at home and locking themselves away, and all the young people are going out, many more of them are going to get infected. And although your individual risk of becoming very sick or even dying is much, much lower if you're a young person, much, much, much lower than an older person. But if lots and lots of you get infected, some people will end up getting really, really ill. And that's the caution. It's exactly what you saw in that Wuhan video, that young people are fed up and they want to go out and party, and we understand that. But the problem is that we will see high rates of spread in adolescence and in the 20s particularly.
And finally, a vaccine, would that help us avoid a second wave?
It certainly would if we had an effective vaccine now. Unfortunately, we won't have an effective vaccine by the time, if we're going to see a second wave, we're going to see it in the next, say, 2-3 months, sort of creeping up on us again as people's behavior changes. But we won't have a vaccine by then. The earliest, I think, that we would expect to see a vaccine commercially available, if all goes well with the clinical trials that are ongoing, would be say, perhaps the middle of next year or towards the end of next year. We might get small amounts of vaccine if we were really lucky by the end of this year, but that's a very tall order. I think we're looking at 2021 to get a vaccine, but we're very hopeful we will. The only thing that everyone should remember is that a vaccine is unlikely to be 100% effective. We're probably going to have a vaccine that's partially effective. So we're still going to be saying to people, you're going to have to go on. As long as this virus is with us until it's gone, we're going to have to go on being cautious in the way that we behave.
Medical researcher Prof. Helen Rees, I appreciate your time. Thank you very much for joining us tonight.